Hi, everybody. I'm coming to you from the COVID bunker. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about understanding the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. People call it the COVID-19 vaccine, but SARS-CoV-2 is the virus and COVID-19 is the infection and the disease. I want to give you just a background on a little bit of immunology, vaccinology, because I want you to understand what is going to be offered to you in just a few short weeks. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, go through a quick presentation with you on immunology and the vaccine. Okay, so vaccine information. Quick review on the immune system. And believe me, you can do a whole semester's worth of work on this. People make their whole life's work understanding how the immune system works, all the idiosyncrasies and intricacies behind that. There are basically two forms of immunity that your body can develop. One is humoral immunity, which is the production of antibodies. Antibodies are proteins that will grab onto foreign material and then mark them so that other cells will come along and Pac-Man them up and just and kill them. And then there's cell-mediated immunity, which is specific cells that are also out there looking and scavenging for foreign material to Pac-Man up and eat. So humoral immunity, cell-mediated immunity. And one of the coolest things about your immune system is it has memory. So when you get infected with something, so let's say chickenpox. I got infected with chickenpox when I was 5 years old. If you draw titers on me right now, you will still find chickenpox antibodies in my system. That is, more than 40 years later, I still have the antibodies. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I have lifelong immunity. Things like smallpox did induce lifelong immunity, but chickenpox, the immunity does begin to wane. So now you see that there's a shingles vaccine out there for people who had chickenpox, because we still have a little bit of inactive virus in our bodies, that it gives us a little booster of immunity so that it keeps those viruses locked away in their little prison cells so it doesn't pop out along one nerve cell and create shingles. And we also know that there's sometimes a lot shorter immunity. So if you get influenza A, within a couple of years, you can get the same strain on you again because your antibody and your immunity wanes over time with that one. So it varies quite a bit from infection to infection. A little bit about the history. This is going to be a common theme because there's been a lot of shade thrown on the science behind vaccines. People are saying, it's hokey. We're injecting you with all these chemicals. This is all pharmaceutical companies trying to make money. This is an attempt by the government to control you and to track you. And look, vaccines have been around in one form or another for thousands of years. The first known one is using smallpox back about 1000 BC in China, where what they would do is they would have someone that had the disease. They would take one of their pox, the scabs, they would scrape it, and they would blow the scrapings up the nose of somebody. And what that did was it gave a very minor infection. So by contrast, if you caught smallpox directly off of somebody, you inhaled it and caught it, mortality was 30 to 50%. But if you got the inoculation this way, the mortality was much, much lower. And so as a result, during these horrible epidemics that they were having of smallpox, they would risk the fact that they might still get a deadly disease, but their chances of surviving it were much lower if they got inoculated versus catching it the normal way. And this was a theme that was followed for a long time. For even the 1700s and far later, they would take the scrapings of the pox and they would rub them into a wound that was made in a healthy person, and the mortality was far lower, somewhere between 5 and 10% in the person they inoculated versus 50%. So this is something that's been known for a long, long time. Vaccines are one of the most amazing things that we have done in public health, if probably the most amazing thing we have done in public health. The reason why life expectancy in the US has changed from the beginning of the 20th century at about 45, 46 years old to the end of the 20th century, and now we're looking at upwards of 80 years old, it's not because of diabetes treatments. It's not because of the development of insulin and antibiotics. It is primarily driven by vaccines because the diseases that used to kill us as children no longer do. This is an interesting graph because if you look at it, you see life expectancy is a nice linear line, but there's one big plummet right here in 1918, and that is the 1918 flu pandemic. So that pandemic was so bad, it actually dropped our US life expectancy by almost 20 years. So vaccines have been absolutely transformative for life expectancy. How do vaccines really work? You're exposing the immune system to one of a few different things. You can either expose it to a much lower burden of active disease, that was scraping the smallpox and somehow getting it into the system of a healthy person. You can take a weakened or killed vaccine, so a live attenuated or an inactivated version of the actual virus or bacteria, and expose the immune system to that, so it's much less likely to create an active infection, but will still stimulate the immune system as if you were infected. You can take pieces of viral protein that do not contain virus. That is how most of our flu vaccines work. So when people say, I got the flu from the flu vaccine, that is not possible because there is no flu virus in the flu vaccine. There are some attenuated versions of it, but for the most part, the one you get from us here in the department is a protein vaccine that cannot infect you. Why do people say that? Because one of two things: either they get a mild illness that feels kind of like a flu that we know happens with vaccines, or they get another virus, because we call everything the flu. And because it's during that season, they say, I got the flu, when the reality is they got a different virus that created a flu-like syndrome. And then there are two other ones that I want to refer to. There's a messenger RNA one, and there's an adenovirus vector vaccine. We're going to come back to that in just a second. So what are the effects of vaccines in the US? So I picked a few of the diseases that you would have heard of. So we have measles, and you see when the measles vaccine got licensed, cases dropped off to almost zero. You still see there are a few bumps, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, but basically measles disappeared. Mumps disappeared. Whooping cough disappeared. Polio disappeared. So this is why we have a much better life expectancy, because when there's no measles around, you're not dying of measles as a kid. Likewise, polio and all the others. So this is the effect of vaccines in the USA. When we stop taking vaccines, we start to see these viruses and these infections come back. So you can see in the upper left that measles had a record number of cases in 2019. For more than the previous 20 or 30 years, we had not seen anywhere near that number of cases. Why? Because people are opting out of the vaccine. We're seeing rises in mumps, we're seeing rises in whooping cough, and who knows, who wants to see a rise in polio and these other ones that are going to eventually make a comeback if we don't stay on top of this. So part of the reason that people do this is because there have been a lot of questions about the science, which has been really answered with study after study after study saying that vaccines are extremely safe. Nothing is 100%. I can't guarantee I won't get hit by a bus when I walk out to my truck in a few minutes, but I know that I'm pretty unlikely to have that happen to me. Vaccines are extremely safe. Now, part of the reason that people have been doing this is because they underestimate the fear, or they underestimate the risk of contracting these diseases. Because when was the last time you knew someone that had measles or mumps or whooping cough or polio? So because it's not in your memory that you've actually seen this, you've known people who died from it or who got disabled from it, people underestimate the risk and they figure, oh, what's the harm? I'm not taking the vaccine. I'm not putting this foreign stuff into my body. And look, I didn't get measles. And what's actually happening is the concept of herd immunity. So herd immunity means that a lot of these infections have to pass from person to person. Compare it to malaria, which gets passed via a mosquito. So if you don't have the mosquito, then you can't catch malaria from somebody. With these infections, they have to spread from an infected person to a susceptible person. But if everyone around you has had the vaccine, then there are people around you are not susceptible to the infection. And so whether you die of the disease or you recover from it, there's no one to spread it to. And so as a result, you don't see epidemics when enough of the herd has immunity. But there is a critical tipping point for all of these infections, at which point you will start to see epidemics occur again. And that is what we're seeing with measles and mumps and whooping cough and things is we are approaching some of these critical masses, and we're beginning to see that these infections are reemerging. So when someone says, I didn't get the measles shot and I never got measles, it's not because their natural immune system fought it off, as I saw someone post on social media. It's because all of the other people around you got the vaccine and there's no one to give it to you. So herd immunity is key. Herd immunity varies from infection to infection. It's a calculation based upon the infectivity of the disease. So for measles, which is extremely infectious, herd immunity requires well over 90% of people to be immune. For things that are less infectious, it does require a lower number of people to be immune to achieve herd immunity. For COVID-19, it appears that it's going to be somewhere in the 60 to 70% range. But a key point here is humanity has never achieved herd immunity without a vaccine. If we were to say, we're going to let this disease run rampant in our society, we're going to just rapidly infect 70% of us, that might work. However, in the process of doing that, even if only 1% of people die from it, what's 1% of 10 million in LA County? What's 1% of 30 million in California? What's 1% of 350 million in the US? It's a huge number of people who will die that don't need to die. On top of it, we don't know how long the immunity from this even lasts. We know there are cases of people who are being reinfected. If the immunity disappears after 6 months, you can't get to herd immunity without a vaccine. So to say right now, when we have a vaccine very close, that we're somehow going to hope for herd immunity is a false narrative. It's not going to happen. And even if we try, it's going to have horrible consequences on our society. So how do these vaccines work? I'm going to get specifically into these two types of vaccines, but here is Spike. This is a little coronavirus stuffy that was sent to me from one of the fire stations, and I can't remember which one, but thank you for sending it to me. It hangs on my office door and has for the last 6 months. But the key to this is coronaviruses are named because when you see it in 2 dimensions, it has a crown around it, thus a corona. When you actually look at it and you sequence it out, what makes the corona are these little spikes, or the spike proteins. So what all the vaccines are doing is attempting to get your body to make antibodies and cell-mediated immunity against the spike proteins. They do it from some different strategies, but that is what they're trying to do. And thankfully, even though the coronaviruses are known to mutate, the spike proteins have been pretty stable. So far, these are showing a lot of effectiveness at producing the antibodies. So 2 main types of vaccines we're seeing. The first one is the messenger RNA vaccines. I'm going to take you back to a little bit of cell physiology from high school or from college. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are both messenger RNA vaccines. This will be the first messenger RNA vaccine that is produced and distributed. Now, people have some angst about being the first of a new vaccine type, but let me explain how this works. And I think I can explain it in a way that you're going to hear it and go, oh, this actually just makes sense. So with the coronavirus, we have completely sequenced the DNA. We had that at the beginning of January of 2020. They have sequenced out the DNA for spike protein. They've been able to make a messenger RNA, which is the blueprint that cells use to put the amino acids together and sort of 3D print the protein that makes the spike. So they've taken the messenger RNA, they have mass produced it, Xeroxed it billions of times, and they put it in a little lipid, which is a kind of a little oily bubble. And the reason they do that is because your cells also are oily bubbles, and it enables the messenger RNA to enter the cell. So they take millions and millions of these little bubbles with messenger RNA blueprints in them. They inject it in your muscle. Your muscle cells absorb those little bubbles. The messenger RNA goes in, finds the ribosome, which is the 3D printer in your cell, and it produces and Xeroxes off spike proteins, which then are either expressed on the surface of your cells or released into the surrounding tissue, and that exposes your immune system to the spike protein without having to actually be infected. So the hope is that you will produce antibodies to it, and these 2 vaccines have shown to have more than 90% effectiveness at producing antibodies, and then we also hope that it produces the cell-mediated immunity as well. I'm going to come back to that in a second. But it's actually very simple. Messenger RNA vaccines are very attractive because they can be mass-produced quickly and cheaply. So if they're effective as well, then this is one of the holy grails of immunology. The other type of vaccine that's likely to come soon is an adenovirus vector vaccine. So adenoviruses are known cold viruses that infect all mammals. There are human ones, there are monkey ones, there are dog ones, there are all kinds of different adenoviruses. And the way they work, these are DNA viruses that when they infect your cells, they've evolved over millions of years to inject their DNA into your cell nuclei, and it then hijacks your cell and makes adenoviruses that eventually are released and go infect other cells and then other cells and other cells and so on. What we've been able to do is take some monkey adenovirus cells. They cleave off the parts of the DNA that produce viruses and cause cell death, and they've inserted in the DNA for spike protein. So now we take advantage of the fact that the adenovirus has evolved to infect your cells and insert its DNA in there, and we put the DNA for the spike protein in there, and then these cells start producing it, releasing it, and expressing it in their cell membranes so that your immune system comes over and starts making antibodies and hopefully cell-mediated immunity as well. This mechanism, we believe, will cause the cells to express it more in the membrane, might provoke more cell-mediated immunity, which is a potential advantage of this vaccine, but we're still waiting on the data from their phase 3 trials. There is some stuff out on social media that says that they use fetal tissue in this. That is not correct. These are monkey adenoviruses. There have been some studies that used fetal tissues from cell lines from an aborted fetus in the 1960s and one from the 1970s that were used to assess the effectiveness of the vaccine. But there are no fetal cells or anything in this. That is a complete misnomer that has been widely propagated on social media. Other people have said that this will permanently change your cell DNA, and there are some cells that will get their DNA changed. That's true. But remember, adenoviruses, there are human adenoviruses all the time. These are some of the more common cold viruses that infect you. And whenever they infect you, they change your DNA as well. So this is not a unique thing that's going on. This is actually taking advantage of something that has evolved over millions of years to be able to infect you. So Operation Warp Speed. So people are saying, well, you know what? I just don't trust this because these vaccines have been brought to market so quickly that it's dangerous, and I don't want to be the lab rat that they're using to study this stuff. So I want to focus a little bit on what Warp Speed did. The typical development of a drug costs billions of dollars and takes years. The reason for that is you have the sort of preclinical time where you develop a drug, you then put it through phase trials. Phase 1, very small scale, looking for any major side effects, any possible benefit. Phase 2, it's a little bit bigger. Phase 3, you get a large scale human trial. Then you submit to the FDA. You wait a long period of time for it to be approved or not approved. And then at some point in that time, you start mass producing it. The drug companies have had many, many drugs die on the lab table at every stage along the way because the drug company determined that their return on investment was just not worth it. It was too high risk, too expensive, not enough of a market. They have shareholders and they just backed out because they didn't want to risk it. The biggest thing that Warp Speed did was it put a bunch of money on the table and said, go ahead and get started. Move through those phases. We're going to take away the financial risk from you. Also, as soon as you identify a candidate that looks like it's going to work, start mass production. Get all the vials you need, syringes, needles, all those things. Get those things, those supply chains lined up. And then they're pushing for something called emergency use authorization, which is a lower bar at the FDA that can be done much quicker than standard FDA approval. So they are moving very quickly, yes, but they are still going through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. They still have the same data safety monitoring boards that are independent of the drug companies. They have all the usual safety features that every vaccine goes through in its development. They just took away a lot of the impediments and speed bumps that the drug companies normally face. So Warp Speed is going to prove to be one of the most outstanding things that we did in response to this pandemic. It's going to be shattering the previous record of the time it took to bring a vaccine to market, which was 5 years in the past. This time it's going to be under a year with a brand new novel infection. Unfreaking believable. Are these safe? Moderna vaccine phase 3 trials, 30,000 participants, Pfizer, 43,000 participants. AstraZeneca, 30,000 participants. Johnson & Johnson will be in that 30,000 plus range. So we're talking about well over 100,000 people will have received the vaccine prior to getting FDA authorization. That is a very large number of people. Any major side effects we're going to see well in advance. Does that mean every side effect? No. If something is a 1 in a million risk, it's going to take millions of doses before you identify it, because you might run a million of them, you'll see it once, but you won't know if it's really caused by the vaccine until you've seen it a few times. So vaccines have been heavily studied. They've been given to billions of people, billions of times. They're some of the most heavily studied medications in history. It is very, very safe. So most common side effects: Moderna, fatigue, muscle aches in the 9 and 10% range, joint aches, headache, injection site pain. These are very common with virtually all vaccines. Pfizer reported fatigue in about 4%, headache in 2%. So again, the media has been sensationalizing this a little bit, that these make you feel much sicker than the usual vaccine. That is not true. It is potentially a little bit more than the usual vaccine, but for the most part, 90+% of people are doing okay. After vaccination, what is it going to mean for you? Does it mean that we go back to life as usual? In order to really turn the corner on this, we have to get people to take the vaccine, to get 60 to 70% of us immune so we can begin to get herd immunity and we can really get back to life as we knew it. So in the short term, while we're still studying what the longer term effects are, how long immunity lasts, do we need to give you a booster shot? How many do we need? Is this going to be a seasonal dose like the flu vaccine? We don't know those answers yet, because only time is going to tell those things. The people who enrolled in those studies, and we should all be very grateful for the people who stepped up and volunteered for that, they're all enrolled in the study for years to look for any long-term effects. So in the short term, masking, distancing, and gatherings are going to stay the same. It's going to be based on the burden of COVID cases that we're seeing in the community. In terms of PPE, recommendations are not going to change until we get a lot more information that shows that people who have been vaccinated are really safe and protected. Not just that we can detect antibodies, but that we have detected that they are not getting sick. And booster shots and those things we'll figure out as we go. Pfizer and Moderna are both 2-shot vaccines. Those are going to be the first ones that hit the market. AstraZeneca and the others we'll see. As, I think the Johnson & Johnson one is testing with a single-dose vaccine. So how do we really turn the corner? We have to get our people to step forward, pull their sleeve up, and take the vaccine. We're going to give you more logistical information as it comes in. Believe me, we're working feverishly on that, trying to get more information. How soon are we going to get vaccine, and what quantities? How does it need to be stored? It's logistically very difficult. The messenger RNA vaccines have a lot steeper requirements to monitor them and to make sure that they're effective and refrigerated and frozen. And we're going to sort through all that. Don't worry about that. We're going to bring information to you as it comes in. But I want you to look at this. The way we end this pandemic is we need people to step up and take the shot. So you will see very early on that I will do the same. I would never, ever recommend for you something I would not do for myself. So I will put my sleeve up and I will take the shot. But this is how we beat this thing. This is how we start to get life back to what we all want it to be. We want to have Thanksgiving dinner in 2021. We want to have Christmas Eve and Christmas in 2021. This is how we get there. Very, very exciting. As always, you know how to find me. Send me your questions, send me your comments and concerns, send it by text, send it by emails, call me, send a crow, whatever, send an owl, don't care. Anyway, I'm happy to always answer you. We'll bring more information as it comes in. Thanks for what you do out there, and stay safe.